us today, Representative Sean Casten, Illinois' 6th Congressional District. Sean is a friend, a colleague of many years. Before Sean became a congressman from the 6th Congressional District, he was an entrepreneur and a clean energy developer. He knows the issues, he knows the substance, he knows the politics, he knows the policy, the business, and the economics. And that's tremendously advantageous, as Representative Casten is a member of the U.S. House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and he's the only member from the Midwest. And his expertise is being brought to bear in Congress, not just as one member, but as, in effect, the Midwest member of the U.S. House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which recently issued its much-awaited report, Solving the Climate Crisis. This is a congressional action plan for a clean energy economy and for a resilient, healthy, and more just America. So we are grateful, Representative Casten, for your joining us today to discuss the report and to share your perspective on it and some next steps. People are here to listen to you, not to me. So I'm going to put the ball over to you right now. And after we hear from Representative Casten, there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. If you want to ask a question, click the Q&A icon on your screen, type in your question. You can do that at any time, and we'll get to as many questions as we can and have the time to do. So without much ado, let me introduce Representative Sean Casten, Illinois 6th Congressional District, a member of the U.S. House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Thank you, Sean, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Howard. Thanks to all of you for joining on. And you're right; these are a little more fun when they're in your office, and the food's usually better
They are.
than the 3-day-old pizza I just had for lunch before coming up here. But we will do what we have to do in this moment. So I'm happy to answer questions about anything, but because we did just release the climate report, I think I just want to focus my intro remarks on what that is, what it isn't, what needs to be done next, and then open up for your questions. So, as you know, the Speaker Pelosi created the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis at the beginning of this Congress. It is a select committee, and what that means practically is that we don't have any jurisdiction. That is our weakness. It is also our strength. It's a weakness because it means that we as a committee did not have the authority to write legislation. We could convene hearings, we could bring in experts, we could get all sorts of testimony, we could issue reports, but we couldn't write legislation. So what you see in that select committee report in no way reflects any legislation that we as a committee wrote. It reflects our recommendations of things that other committees of jurisdiction did. The reason why I say that's also a strength is because if you're going to deal with climate policy, there is no committee at which the buck stops. You can do energy policy to some degree in the Energy and Commerce Committee, unless you're going to get into futures markets, in which case you've got to be on the Ag Committee. You can, unless you're going to worry about what happens in capital markets, in which case you're going to go to financial services, or maybe you're concerned about transportation issues, in which case you're a transportation infrastructure. You get my point. Climate policy, energy policy, it spreads every committee. And I think, and that creates a problem because when you limit yourself to committees of jurisdiction, you end up stopping before you've completed the work. So our mandate was to take our weakness, turn it into a strength, and come out with a set of recommendations. We did what my friend David Roberts described as the most serious, comprehensive report on climate that Congress has ever done, and I take a lot of pride in that, in part because I have so much respect for David Roberts, but also because what we set out to do was to not do what I think too many climate bills have historically in Congress have done, which is let's take credit for things rather than saying what did we get done, what has to be done. So we started with science. What do we have to do? We then went through and looked at all the bills that had been introduced relative to our recommendations. The subject area recommendations we had in this Congress recommended about 500 of them as things that we think the Congress should do. We then went through, got an outside group to go through and actually calculate the environmental and economic impact of every one of those bills for which you could calculate the impact. Now, that's important. Because we calculate that if you implement all of our recommendations, you'd cut CO2 emissions by 88% by 2050. You would save, I'm forgetting the number now, I think it's $7 trillion. By the way, that's $7 trillion in health and social costs. It does not include energy savings yet, because we haven't quite figured out how to calculate that, but the savings would be greater because clean energy is cheap energy. It would save 65,000 lives a year, I think is the latest number. 65,000 lives, sorry. No, 65,000 lives a year by 2050. But it doesn't include things like, for example, I have a bill I've introduced, the Climate Financial Risk Disclosure Act, that would require banks to essentially treat climate change as a systemic risk, so that you don't overcompensate the banks and give banks an incentive to move their investment holdings to things that are less exposed. I think any reasonable person would conclude that that will increase the flow of capital to less risky things and will help clean up the environment, but you can't put a precise score on that. So things like that aren't included in the total. But the point of that is that we didn't set out at the start and say, we will define success by getting CO2 down by 88% in 2050. And so we don't claim that what we've done is sufficient. What we've done is say, this is what's necessary. These are all the bills that have been done in this Congress that we think are worth doing. And then here's some other things that we encourage committees of jurisdiction to take up, write the rules, get them done, and move this forward. Because ultimately, we don't pretend that getting to zero CO2 by 2050 is sufficient. We don't pretend that getting to zero CO2 by 2035 is sufficient. We got to get to zero CO2 by 1985, because that's the last point that CO2 was sort of consistent with where it's been for the last 100,000 years, when we evolved from people roaming around hiding from glaciers to people that had arts and religion and cities and agriculture and all the rest of that stuff. And that's where we have to get to. So we have to get to negative emissions as well. I'm sure you've got a ton of questions about what's in the report. More than happy to talk through those. There are separate sections. It's about 500 pages. There are sections on transportation, electricity, environmental justice, oceans, you name it. Go through and I'll do my best to answer any questions. But on a going forward basis, to the way that you framed this up, our grandchildren are not going to judge us by the quality of our report. And I know I don't have to say that to this audience, but I would ask you all to not waste any energy praising us for writing a report. We wrote a roadmap. Now we got to start driving. And what we have to do next is to make sure that that becomes a priority to get done. And I almost tripped up myself. I almost said a priority in the next Congress, right? Because we would all probably agree that in the remainder of this Congress, and with Mitch McConnell at the Senate and with Trump in the White House, these things aren't going to become law. That could all be true. But the environment doesn't give a damn about the politics, right? We have to move these things forward into legislation, regardless of whether or not it is a politically opportune moment, because it hasn't been a politically opportune moment for the last 25, 30 years, apparently. And so we keep fiddling while Rome burns. So judge us, pressure us, put the heat on, keep the attention up to get these things signed into law. I'm very proud of what we've done, but this is step one. Now we got to do the hard lifting. So thank you for having this, and let me then stop and take any questions you got.
Let me queue one up to get it started. And Congressman, I'm going to sum up and pull together a number of questions that people have posted in sort of groups. The first is, it's a 500-page report. It includes a lot of very, very good things. I know some of those are near and dear to you and that you really focused heavily on. What are your top 3 priorities in there? What are the things that you're most proud of and you'd really like to, put some extra energy into moving forward?
Oh, look, I mean, selfishly, I suppose I want to move the bills that I've played an important role in bringing forward and getting recommended in here, because I had a number of bills that I wrote that did it. So I had I mentioned the Climate Financial Risk Disclosure Act, and then the Climate Financial Risk Act and the Climate Risk Disclosure. Both of those are in financial services that I'm on, and we actually had a path to bring the second of those to the floor before COVID hit. One of those, as I mentioned, requires the banks to look at climate as a systemic risk. The other standardizes corporate reporting to consistently report either your contribution to the problem or contribution to the solution, to essentially create a generally accepted accounting principles, if you will, for ESG as relates to carbon. And again, I think those things are hugely important, because if you do both of those, we will better allocate capital to the risks that it faces with climate. The other one, which is a little bit of a wonky one, but I think it's really important, is the Energy Price Act. And this is a bill that simply reminds FERC that under the 1935 Federal Power Act, they have an obligation in their rulemakings to factor in things, including but not limited to environmental impacts, things beyond just prices. And the reason why I think that one's more important than it gets credit for is that as I've talked with Commissioner Glick, Chairman Chatterjee, all of them will agree that clean energy is creating a problem. Energy is getting too cheap. And as the price of energy falls, we're going to lose our incentive we're going to lose the economic case for investing in new assets. We're going to lose the economic case for conservation. And that's because we've structured markets in ways that causes the preponderance of the economic gain of clean energy to flow through to consumers. That's awesome for consumers, but we've got to make sure that the balance of that, there are investors, there are consumers, there are labor groups. We've got to make sure that those gains are allocated in a way that is sustainable. FERC has the jurisdiction to do that already. We've simply reminded them to get it done. And then I guess the last big one is the Promoting Grid Storage Act, which we got into HR2, the big infrastructure bill we just passed 2 weeks ago. And this was to put about $600 million into targeted grid storage, with a particular eye on the Midwest, because for those of you who nerd out on EIA reports, we've actually started to see CO2 emissions start to creep up again in the Midwest, because we've been so successful at deploying renewable energy that you're seeing a lot of inefficient gas engines running at half load to balance load, because we can't figure out politically how to build transmission. And if we can't build transmission, the only other way to make sure that we can continue to build renewable energy and drive carbon down is to put targeted energy storage around that can shave that out a little bit. So we got that one through the science committee I sit on, and then into the infrastructure bill. So it has a path, and that one by the way has a lot of bipartisan, bicameral support as well. So could be an interesting one to push forward.
You're right, it is wonky, but you're also right. That energy storage piece that you've gotten pushed through is extraordinarily important in terms of cleaning up the grid and resiliency. There are a number of questions, Congressman, about how does the report that's come out of the Select Committee align with what Vice President Biden has recommended over the last couple of days? Where are the similarities? Where are the differences? Directionally, is it moving? Can you comment on that?
So I have not yet had the chance to go through the Vice President's whole plan. So I'd, if you give me a week or so, I can be more informed on that.
All righty. Fair enough.
I think certainly the summaries have been very consistent. And in terms of the priorities, I think I think the positive thing is that sort of, as Sheldon Whitehouse points out, the sort of the aperture of possibility, I guess Overton's window, if you want to use that, has expanded. And you see that in what we've done. I'd like to believe we've contributed to that in some fashion. And you see it in what Biden is proposing, which is, whether or not you love Biden's plan, you think it needs to be more aggressive. I don't think anybody would argue that it's not massively more ambitious than Waxman-Markey, right? The last time we were talking about this sort of stuff. And so we're at least acknowledging the problem. I think the challenge that we all have is what I said a moment ago. We've got to get these things signed into law yesterday. And I'm seeing notes, by the way. I see some people popping up that my volume is too low. I'm not sure. I apologize if something's going on here. I don't know if anybody has any back office way to do that. This is the same speaker I usually use, but I will try to talk a little louder if it helps.
We'll work on that on our end too. So you all know, some people asked if we would post the link to the Select Committee's report. We've done that. That's available in the chat. Some questions, Congressman, about how did the process work that came up with the report? Chair Castor held some hearings here involving the Great Lakes. As you know, there's been, the committee is Democratic without Republican support. Are there some Republicans who are interested in it, who perhaps didn't want to be on the committee per se, but are otherwise engaging? How did it come about, and where do you see it going in that respect?
Um, I'm chuckling because when you have legislative authority as a committee, there are processes for committees that make a lot of sense. You know, a given member introduces an amendment, you mark it up, you have debate, what have you. I don't think anybody really likes writing a report by committee. And that's true not just for people. For people
Absolutely.
And can you imagine, Howard, if you were writing some ELPC report, and not only were you writing by committee, but each chapter had to be voted on by all members of the ELPC staff, and you only approved the chapters that got a majority vote. So
don't even ask me to go there. Our staff right now, the chat room should be our staff chuckling.
Yeah, exactly. But that was essentially the question we had, right? How do you write a report by committee?
Right.
And so what the process was we had a whole lot of hearings. I've lost track of how many hearings we've had, most in Washington, but we did have some field hearings, as you mentioned, one out here at the aquarium, field hearings out at NREL. I'm forgetting we had some other field hearings as well. I'll remember them later. All members were invited to all hearings. Most members participated, certainly in all the DC ones. Obviously, once you travel, you get a little bit less of a footprint. And then we went through saying, okay, what's the best way to write the report? And we, the majority staff, started drafting a report, and basically ended up writing our majority report, and then saying to our colleagues across the aisle, why don't you guys write a minority report? And if we can, let's try to time so that we can bring them all together at the same time. And then we could say, here's the majority opinions, here's the minority opinions, here's the ones that are bipartisan that have come out. I don't know where the minority report is, and I don't know if there's going to be one, but we've at least issued ours, and I would hope they would issue theirs. I think in general, the pieces that are overwhelmingly bipartisan are planting trees and funding for research and development. Actually doing things that will lower carbon today, that will change the incentives, things that will get rid of the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, things that will actually provide a level playing field, are not very bipartisan. And what we've said to the minority members on the committee is, because we put all ours together, and because we had this outside group, Hal Harvey, if you don't know them, they do just fantastic work. I think it's called I always forget the name of this group. It's got a very boring name, Energy Futures or something like that. But they did
Energy Innovations.
Energy Innovations, thank you. Hal's totally neutral. So we said, look, he's said this is the economic impact of our proposals. This is the carbon impact of our proposals. Come up with your report and let's score it, because if yours is better, awesome, right? Let's do it. If you've got some things that are different, but we'll see. We'll see what they come up with. But I don't. Maybe there's some smart way that someone will come up with to write a report with majority and minority by committee, but we didn't figure it out. So we just ultimately said, we'll write the majority one, and there's room for dissenting opinions if people want to propose an alternative, and we'll score them all the same basis.
A couple of questions about looking forward. If Vice President Biden's elected president, do you think that creates more space by which there'll be room for more Republican members of Congress to really work across the aisle with you and Speaker Pelosi's caucus on climate change issues? Can the November election, if you will, break the deadlock on that? What do you think?
Look, what I care about is that the majority of the people in Washington care about climate change. I do not care what party they're members of. But if we but if we compromise because we care about the number of participants based on the letter hanging after their name, then we haven't prioritized climate change. I don't know the answer to that question, Howard, because I have not seen, my favorite Republican was Denver Riggleman, who I tried to do work on climate change with, and he told me, climate change is like gay marriage. If I support it, I'll get primaried. And then he officiated a gay wedding, which is part of the reason why I like him so much, and he just lost his primary. His colleagues know that, right? And that's unfortunate, but in the meantime, the climate keeps changing. I think the challenge for us all to keep in mind is just park all your politics at the door. Are we electing people who will prioritize this, and are we electing people who understand the issues? Because I've got a lot of colleagues who prioritize this, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle. I don't have a lot who totally understand the issues. And I don't say that as a criticism. I have colleagues who understand healthcare policy way better than I do, criminal justice reform way better than I do, tax policy way better than I do. There's not a lot who come from a climate background. And so I think one of the things, and we've seen this in some of the, to take a contentious issue, the issues of environmental justice. For those of you on this call, you're all down in the weeds, you're wonks with me. You all appreciate that lowering CO2 emissions is not going to do anything about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, right? These are different pollutants. They are absolutely important issues. This isn't like we should do one and not the other. We should do both, but they're not necessarily related. And there's a large set of conversations that says we should deal with climate because it's an environmental justice issue. Well, there's an overlap in those Venn diagrams, but they're not wholly tied together. And I raise that issue because if we prioritize simply people who say, I've found good political rhetoric to drive this forward, then we're going to drive very hard on green jobs. We're going to drive very hard on environmental justice. And that's not necessarily the same as building solar farms where the sun is shining, building transmission, which may require some eminent domain to get it to load, and shifting from a grid that is very labor intensive because of all the ash handlers and fuel handlers and steam pipe fitters to a grid that has modern technology that has much higher labor productivity, right? Those are good things, but that's a little bit incompatible with what polls really well, which is to say this will solve environmental justice and green jobs issues. And so I think our challenge right now is to make sure that we elevate that expertise, because I think there's a real risk that we may end up promising some things we can't deliver otherwise.
Congressman, there's some questions of just your views and your takes on the growing carbon solutions, proposed legislation that's been proposed on carbon fee and dividend. What's your take on that, both in terms of your own substantive views, and do you think they have legs going into the next Congress?
So fill me in the first of those, growing carbon solutions. I'm familiar with fee and dividend. Tell me what the first one is all about.
The Growing Climate Solutions Act was proposed about a week ago. It's designed to accelerate climate solutions, and I'm sure my colleague Janet McCabe can get you a briefing paper on it.
Okay.
But you don't have to, if you haven't read it, you don't have to respond to it here. It's not a gotcha question.
Okay.
And how about?
I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with that one. On the fee and dividend, we very intentionally in the report did not recommend any carbon pricing program. We did say that we should have carbon pricing. We recommend that Congress adopt some sort of a carbon pricing mechanism. We also were very clear that carbon pricing is not independently sufficient. There are sectors it's not going to work for. It's really hard to make carbon pricing work in the agriculture space, for example. How do you meter the amount of carbon that a tree takes up or the amount of carbon that's retained in soils? We know what practices we'd like to do, but it's hard to do that from a practice. For reasons, for economic reasons, I think it's also harder to get carbon pricing to really work very well in the transportation sector. But we did recommend carbon pricing. With respect to fee and dividend, this is now me talking as me, not me talking as a member of the committee. the entire reason why we have any conversation about carbon pricing at all is because I think there's been a lot of really good intellectual work around monetizing externalities and using market forces to drive environmental solutions. And from the Montreal Protocol to the Sulfur Trading Program, we've seen that work. For markets to work, I have a really simple rule. This is maybe too dumb and too simple, but it's a real simple rule. The price that you pay to buy something should be roughly equivalent to the price that you get for selling that thing. The market for avocados is extremely efficient in that regard. What Jewel gets is what I pay them for an avocado. The market for shoes is very efficient. The vast majority of proposed carbon pricing rules don't even come close to passing that test. Because what we say is we're going to pay for the right to pollute, but the person who's reducing pollution is not the seller, it's the government who's going to sell. And then we're going to have this huge inefficiency as far as how the government allocates those resources back. And so when you have a carbon tax, to take just the simplest one, will generate trillions of dollars a year in government revenue. How are we going to spend that money? And do you think that is going to be economically efficient? And do you think that if it costs $50 a ton to emit, we're going to pay $50 a ton to every solar panel that reduces it? Or are we going to find a whole lot of political pressure to use those funds for all sorts of other things, maybe noble things, right? And the fee and dividend, I think, is singularly bad, because by taking the money and then directing it's going to go to every individual in some kind of a tax, a rebate or however it gets dividended out, we are guaranteeing that it does not flow to the people who are reducing CO2 emissions pro rata with their reduction. And if you give me the choice, I think a proper market-based solution to carbon pricing. If we don't want to do market-based solutions, that's a separate conversation. But if we're going to use market-based tools, which I personally support, there should be carrots and equally sized sticks. And if you make me choose between a carrot or a stick, I will take a carrot every day. Because once you incentivize someone to build a solar panel, you don't need a lot of continuing incentive. It's got zero marginal operating cost, right? But if you simply penalize someone for burning coal, why do you care if you're a solar developer? Okay, Peabody had to pay more taxes last year. Wells Fargo paid $3 billion of fines last year. I have an account at Schwab. As best as I can tell, it did not affect the interest rate I earn on my Schwab deposits. There is no economist in the world who says it would. And yet there are economists who say that if you put a price on carbon emissions, pollution, it will change the incentive to build carbon reduction. I think it's shoddy economics.
Congressman, I'm glad to see that we agree that the economics of the electricity sector is more complicated than avocados. At the same time, marginally, when I was a law student, I took a business school class in agricultural economics and learned about milk pricing rules and the Eau Claire pricing rule. It's just convoluted too.
Coming from New England, the New England Dairy Compact is you could do a PhD thesis on that.
Oh, and the way Vermont and Wisconsin and California compete. We'll talk about that one later.
Yeah.
Look, thank you for everything you do in Congress as a climate solutions leader. Thank you for everything you do as the congressman from the 6th Congressional District. We appreciate your work, and we especially appreciate your knowledge and the substance that you bring to it in terms of getting things done. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to everybody who participated today. Heads up, Congresswoman Sherry Bustos will be joining us July 28th, 9:30, particularly to talk about the impact of climate issues in rural America. So you'll be getting an invite. Please join us. In the meantime, thank you from all of us, Congressman Casten, for joining us today and for what you're doing and getting done in Congress. We appreciate it. Bravo.
Thank you, Leonard, and thanks to all of you at ELPC. Thank you for what you do, because you are the ones who keep the political pressure up, that keep my colleagues saying, holy smokes, we better keep this ball moving forward.
Good.
So keep the pressure on us.
We will. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us.
Take care.